cutting across multiple geographies, especially in Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, a little bit of East Asia, and of course North America. So in the evening, today we have with us Brian McGrath, a very old friend. We've worked together in various geographies in the world for the last decade or so, who is a professor of urban design and also the dean of the School of Constructed Environments at the New School. So really glad to have Brian here and other colleagues from NSSR and the India-China Institute and Parsons. We're going to have sort of a back and forth next hour or so on a whole range of questions that we've been trying to deal with. But, more than anything else, I'd say that this is a bit of a biographical sketch of going to be talking about his journey over the last 30, 40 years or so as a designer, as a practicing urban designer and architect, and his own sort of engagement in the field of design and architecture, and especially in the last 20 years or so, dealing with questions of ecosystems, of resilience, of sustainability, questions that are sort of central to the agenda that we deal with here, both in India and specifically at the IIHS. So, Brian has had a very colorful history, starting with Syracuse, then Princeton, and then, of course, the New School, and then Columbia, and then finally back to the New School again. So a lot of sort of movement in and out of the East Coast. But most interestingly, in Thailand now for more than, 25 years? Yeah, 20 years of work in Thailand. So a very interesting cross-cultural perspective that I hope that we'll see today. And of course, work that some of us have done in East Asia, specifically with colleagues from China in some parts of China. So I guess over to Brian. It's wonderful to have you back. You're one of the early participants in our somewhat crazy experiments at IIHS, the curriculum frame. Yeah. It's nice to have you here.
No, and it's great to be here. Thank you, Ara. And thank you, Ashokaram, for making this 10-year conversation possible, because Ara and I met through the India-China Institute. We're at the New School. We were both fellows. It was before I even had a full-time teaching position at the New School, and I was mostly teaching at Columbia, and so Ara and I continued our conversation beyond the fellowship. You came to Columbia when we were working on our studios there.
Bangkok.
I came here, and when you were building your curriculum, you were a very important part of a discussion of a book that recently came out on resilience and ecology and urban design with Cary Institute for Ecosystem Studies and Dr. Stuart Pickett, and also with Graham Shane, kind of chief theorizer of urban design up at Columbia. And so we've been having these interdisciplinary, transnational conversations for 10 years, and it's, so the India-China Institute isn't just, about individuals and their experiences, but really generating these conversations, which are ongoing. And it's great to have some new blood in the conversations, and a really interesting conversation now that we're having, and led by Vicky Haddam, who's really brought us together under the umbrella of the spatial politics of work. And so, and thank you all for coming tonight and back in New York, for forgiving me for not being there when I should be there, because we're preparing for the semester to start. But the reason I wanted to start off with an apology as an architect is that, of course, Xi Jinping has said, no more weird architecture. We're sort of at the end of a glut of very extreme architecture. I'm in this schizophrenic position of being a professor of urban design, and so actually urban design is a discipline that is not in the school I'm a dean of. I'm a dean of a school of architecture, interior design, lighting design, product design. So I'm going back to my roots as an architect, and like serving under another dean and advising the urban program at Parsons. And so, so I think I really wanted to be a little bit biographical and talk about, whoops, did I just shut it off or something? Okay. I think I did something. Okay, I fixed it. and talk about June 1981, when I graduated from architecture school and moved to New York, trained, And I remember the last words of my thesis professor after 7 years of architecture education. But coming from a first generation in higher education and an immigrant family, and he said, you know, architecture is a gentleman's profession. And I said, uh-oh, I got the message really clear. I got into Princeton, but it didn't exactly bring me into a class where I could immediately find the clients. But at the same time, June 1981, unbeknownst to me, this is an archival photograph I dug up that remarkably is a photograph taken on a weekend in June in 1981. The same month I entered the job market in New York City as an architect. And what you see is a photograph of the weekend in June when they changed the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange from paper trading to electronic trading. And so over a weekend, the world changed, and I didn't really know what was going on. I was busy drafting by hand in the office that just hired me, and the skills I was trained, which were very 19th century kinds of Beaux-Arts educational skills. Of course, this was part of a new a form of municipal government that Ed Koch led after the financial default, almost near financial default in New York City in the mid-70s, where municipal government in New York was remade into as a new model for urban governance everywhere, as enticing investment instead of providing social services for the citizens of the city. And so if you can't afford it, then move. I think it resonates with some of the work that we've seen about affordability and housing in Bangalore now. This is the moment when it began. And this is the neighborhood I moved in with people like Ai Weiwei and Madonna across the street. And so this is the East Village in New York, and where I had a very cheap, affordable apartment, but this is the condition that city was in. And so the other, I think I keep on doing something wrong. So the struggle for space was intense in that neighborhood because buildings were emptied out, squatters were moving in, the city was trying to barricade them because it was moving from a legal homesteading situation to making it illegal to occupy empty space. And Tompkins Square Park was renewed, and homeless people were kicked out, and so the residents of the neighborhood fought to allow the homeless to have a dignified place to live. And
similar battles in Berlin,
yeah,
in Rio at that point of time.
Yeah, Amsterdam. I remember going to Amsterdam and being in the middle of a squat force out. And it was also 1981 was the year Ronald Reagan assumed office, and this is a poster from ACT UP. It was also the year that AIDS arrived in New York City. It didn't have a name yet, but the first deaths were recorded in 1981. So this is my generation. It's not exactly the 60s kind of flower child or the generation before me that occupied the lofts and had this wonderful moment. It's something that's the 1979 generation that's been recently identified. You know, this book, Strange Rebels, about the alignment of capitalism and religion in this secular world that was thriving in the 60s and 70s.
This is a time in India that Mrs. Gandhi has just come back. So we had a period in the mid-1970s, which was sort of a denial of democracy. We had a very traumatic period here between 75 and 77, where Mrs. Gandhi basically established the emergency. She was pushed out of power, and this sort of radical experiment of a different kind of democratic politics, in a sense, imploded in 79. She comes back, she rides back to power in 1980 again, and then that's actually people, the beginning of the wave of liberalization actually starts in the early 1980s. It's weak, but it starts in the 1980s. So there is a bit of an echo. It's still got strong socialist, popularist sort of, the undertone. But the opening up of the Indian economy and the engagement with the outside world starts around the same time. And then, of course, in China, that's the beginning of after.
Well, it's Deng is 1979.
Exactly.
Yeah. But it's also Pope Jean Paul and Ayutthaya Khomeini and Margaret Thatcher. So that's the strange rebels that sort of all came to power in 1979. And so how does one trained as a gentleman architect practice architecture in this field? And so I call it damage control. I didn't realize this was happening. I mean, we were inside it, and it's only in historical reflection that I understand. We were part of a huge adjustment in the economy and society, and the physical space of the city was the space where it's contested. And so my training was very much coming from a European critique of the modern city, and Aldo Rossi in particular, the architecture of the city. Not the architecture of the building in the city, the weird architecture that we see, but the architecture of the city. By putting this simple preposition in his title, he really reconfigured how an architect could practice within the city, not as the designer of a signature building described by property boundaries and legal contracts, but the city as an artifact in itself that is an object of design, but collective design over time. And so the work that I did in that period was mostly, renovations of lofts and tenement apartments and affordable housing solutions. Worked with a lot of nonprofit organizations, a lot of pro bono work, and it was very much in retrospect that I call it damage control, because it was so small scale given the large scale forces. As an architect, my form of research was drawing, and so I started a drawing project, which is I began to collect maps of both Rome and New York, historical maps, and Rome became the kind of measure that I was going to bring to New York to understand urban adaptation and change, because Rome, of course, is the city that went from an imperial capital to the shrunk medieval city, which was self-sustaining, not reliant on the infrastructures of the aqueducts and the road, food structures of an empire, but had to be a self-sufficient city built on social units of monasteries and convents and family groups. And so that city became an object of interest. And for the contemporary world, this neighborhood in ruins, it was really became what I call an archaeology of capitalism. So Transparent Cities is a box set of plates of the city at different periods of time, and you really can see how the city gets reconfigured as capitalism reconfigures itself in specific periods of time. And basically, I divide it up into the mercantile capital, the industrial capital, and the service financial capital.
And this is before the Mac and before...
These are hand-drawn,
exactly.
no GIS.
No GIS, yeah.
Kind of getting all the maps from the New York Public Library at the right scale and picking certain elements. And so again, I'm only trained as an architect. I practice as an architect. I did this thing as an architecture of the city project. But the director of urban design at Columbia said, "Oh, why don't you come teach urban design?" And I said, "Okay, what's urban design? I can teach that." And so I basically had to invent the field in my own terms, and as I was brought to Columbia in the early 90s. I don't know, sometimes I have to do this. Okay. Which brings us to the next decade. So August 1991. So I was invited to come to teach at Parsons before I started at Columbia in August 1991. And I teach design studios, architectural design studios, and I said, they said, you have to teach another course. And I said, well, I can teach drawing. I said, well, if you teach drawing, we just bought these Macs and the beta version of software, and can you learn that, so like a month before classes start, an 18-year-old undergraduate from Argentina taught me
how to use a Mac.
How to use a map, how to use three-dimensional software, which was just in a beta version of something called Form Z at the time. And so finally I had seized production, so 10 years after that, I was not bound by the gentleman architect. I wasn't just doing damage control. We had this new tool. It was the 90s. Clinton was coming in, globalization. My students were from around the world. We had they introduced the paperless studios at Columbia at the time, so let's just have a ball. And so it was a great optimistic moment, and I was talking to Aromar about it. And Arjun Apatharai's book, Modernity at Large, was our kind of Bible. You know, this is the scapes of globalization.
96.
96. It was incredibly optimistic about this group of students from around the world that were looking at urban design in a completely open-ended way because of this new tool, which was collaborative, which was multidisciplinary. We could work with community groups, ecologists, things like that, at every scale imaginable. And so, so that's for me became, you know, the 2.0 version of design. And so the project that came out of that led to the ecosystem work is something called Manhattan Time Formations, which is a pretty elaborate interactive website, again, beta version of Flash software, and you know, it's almost looks like an early video game like Pong or something like that in terms of its rendering. But this is me in terms of data. This is you know, like my one data-driven project. And it was just the set of data was the Class A high-rise office building registry for New York City.
New York skyscrapers.
Yeah.
That's what, yeah.
Over 150,000 square feet. And so all I had was data of Lower Manhattan, Midtown Manhattan, and number of buildings built per year. And so this graph basically shows, I don't know, oh, here it is. You know, the birth of the skyscraper, oh, let's build some, and then the first boom of the stock exchange in the 20s, and then the collapse, of course, and then followed by World War II. Except RRR, those are the towers of the Rockefeller Centers. The Rockefellers had money during that period. And then post-war, you know, again, gradually the beginning of America as a centric consumerist culture, Park Avenue, you know, Seagram's, Lever House, you know, again, crash, oil crisis, 1970.
Yeah, the first oil,
Yeah.
72.
And so this boom is 1981.
Yeah.
So this is completely as a result of electronic digitalization of the stock exchange, and all the early work I was doing was like a, you know, paper Wall Street firm moving up to Midtown and needing a computer office space, and, you know, the kind of culture clash between crown molding and computerized workspace. And so, but you can see that the slope is reversed. It was completely over speculation and went sky high at the beginning, and the market collapsed. And so, which is, of course, as an architect, why I had time in 1990 to do this project and to start teaching, because there were no jobs. And so, so this project ends at you know, 1990 when I started the thing. But it's a kind of a time capsule, I think, in a sense. So this is a kind of 2D description of something that's a four-dimensional interactive 3D model. And so basically that timeline, if you flip it on its side, and
These are
1890s at the bottom, right, exactly, 1900s here, 1950, 2000. And so I just placed the 3D model of each skyscraper in geographical space, its correct height on a timeline when it gets constructed. And so you can see the patterns in space and time of office building construction in New York. And, you know, my hypothesis is basically that, you know, of course, location, everyone wants to build in the same place at the same time. And government is always regulating a little bit too late. So you can see how the setback law follows the construction of all these office buildings, and then it changes color from yellow to white when the regulation of the building sets in. And then the periods of collapse of economy and lack of construction is actually the period of technological innovation. And so the air conditioning, fluorescent lighting, light glass curtain wall comes in the interwar period. And so, you know, the building of daylighting and cross ventilation is, so to speak, and the the air-conditioned nightmare and the man in the gray flannel suit. And if you have the TV series Mad Men here, you know that
So
period.
this is the figure with Jane Jacobs,
Yes.
so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you're not seeing the Jane Jacobs in this.
Yeah. Well, and then of course we're using these techniques for every scale or project to look at things like that. This is just really looking at the force of capital and at its most extreme. And if you did this today in New York, it would be all $50 million condominium buildings, you know, so which are what's being built today. Then the Bonfire of the Vanities is this boom right after the introduction of electronic trading and the digital workplace and globalization. And then when I did this project, there were just the beginnings of the development of Times Square and media things of pushing Midtown West, which was, again, a product of planning, realignment of infrastructure with bulk in the city. And so you get a kind of architecture story of the building, and actually the technological change, of course, in the 70s was the introduction of the digital. So that was quite interesting because you could see synthetically economy, governance and planning, architecture dealing with the material reality and new kinds of technologies. And then it's also really interesting to see who's occupying in those buildings.
The interesting thing in this, of course, is that many other places in the world were being modeled on New York, way out to the early 2000s. So whether it's Hong Kong at one end or Shanghai or you know some parts of what happened with Singapore, they're all driven by not even New York, but Manhattanization of process.
Well, and this over speculation in '81 was a huge lesson, and so even build an office building without renting a certain percentage of it before you start construction, or a condominium selling a certain number of units before construction starts. And so there's certain, but Dubai didn't follow that, I guess.
Well, they have their own crap.
Yeah, that's true. So the model is a four-dimensional model, and so you can navigate it as a kind of database in space and time. So this view, you're on a time plane of 1950, and you're looking, I believe, across 42nd Street. So the middle of this is 42nd Street. And then there's pop-ups where you can really look at the interaction between historical infrastructures, land, building type, what kind of is being built with the construction of the office building. So you see the relationship landfill and lightweight glass and steel construction versus the heavier construction on the solid ground, or the Dutch city and Wall Street and things like that. And zoning, how it begins to shape the city. So there's a zoning map with infrastructure and how bulk is balanced in Midtown Manhattan. So so skyscraper. It's a public art project for the Skyscraper Museum, publicly funded. I developed this interface, which is really user-friendly because I had to do those damn participatory meetings because it was a public art project. So I said, I can't do that, But it was really wonderful because I had this new tool of software, and I had to explain it to different kinds of groups, whether they're planners or tourists or historian buffs. It produced this kind of easily interfaced artifact. So this was published in Wired magazine, and one of the geeks at the U.S. Forest Service who was doing this urban ecosystem work in Baltimore said, wow, you're doing skyscrapers like we do forest succession. There's this sort of temporal thing. Can you join our group of scientists researching Baltimore, Maryland, and how to adapt the city from what we call a sanitary city to a sustainable city? And so the city is built at a certain period of time and a certain kind of infrastructure that precludes really achieving sustainability. And so how do you restructure it? So it was a really like being just an architect doing these drawings who was hired to teach urban design. I became an urban designer because of that, not because I was trained, but because I had that chance to think about urban and becoming an urban ecologist. because of the things that I was trying to understand in terms of how cities adapt and change, ecological questions. And so that's was this remarkable thing where Stuart Pickett, who leads the Baltimore ecosystem study, was coined the ecology of the city the same way I was inspired by the architecture of the city instead of in the city.
This is probably one of the first long-term projects. I mean, there are others in the US and other parts of the world which actually look at how urban systems function as ecosystems. So it's not only the built environment, but also the living environment within it, and below and above and around it, how water and the other resources actually flow. So trying to understand how we can use the tools of ecology, or at least the frame of ecology, and be able to insert the built environment within this, because it's sort of not so obvious. But of course, if you go back maybe 70 or 80 years, one of the debates that started in India in almost a century ago, when Patrick Geddes came here, was really this view of the city as a metabolic entity.
Yes.
And his work on urban surgery, which happened first in Mysore and in other cities in the country, was a beginning of this understanding. And of course, he influenced Mumford, and Mumford came back with planning and stuff like that. But it's a very sort of interesting route, moving in from sort of a gentleman designer into actually trying to understand how these processes have their own dynamics, which are systemic and not necessarily, are not subject to the rules and the hegemony of the sort of the designer, who he or she can actually control the object and everything around it.
Yeah, and so so this encounter, like in the mid-90s, with Arjun Appadurai, the ecologist, globalization, this global student body. I was teaching at Columbia for a few years, and I tell this story. I kind of looked up off the podium and I said, half of my students are from Asia. I did this book on Rome and New York, and I had no idea what kind of cities. So I basically said I want to understand Asian cities, but I don't want to globetrot. I have to find a city that will support my interest, and there's a mutual interest. And so I asked all my to introduce me to their professors and their schools that they came from, and I didn't have a student from India at that time, or they came much later, a little bit later, but there were plenty from India, but from Hong Kong, Thailand, and it was at Chulalongkorn University that a good match was made. And so through the Fulbright program, I spent a year, 98, 99 there. So again, that feeling of euphoria of globalization and this new technology, of course, ended in New York, at least in September 11th, and so there's let's say intense experience to because school starts in September, and to have this student population of 45 students from around the world, and you stop classes because the shops in the city is under a state of siege. And so I feel at this moment it was a different kind of, it wasn't, we didn't really seize the means of production. I mean, it was, and so it was much more an activist project that created.
But just to hold for a moment there, you were in Columbia, you were uptown.
Yeah.
How did it look from sort of uptown, looking at what was happening?
It's interesting because I was still teaching, because as a part-time faculty at the new school, I had medical coverage, and this is a U.S. thing. So I managed to keep teaching these two.
So you're moving between the village
like Cinemetrics was completely developed at Parsons, small scale, architecture scale at this time. And so Parsons was in the red zone, so I arrived on the PATH train and showed up, and no one was on the street, and I didn't realize I was in a red zone, and went up to Columbia. Of course, things were normal. It's a little bit like Sandy, that there was a kind of very different kind of geography in uptown and downtown. But because I had students from, say, Peru of a recent terrorist history, or other countries that, and students from the Middle East, who all of a sudden visas were in crisis and things like that. it was, we couldn't design anymore. We couldn't do the project that I had prepared for them anymore. We just had to sit, and what we did was just map who was working in the World Trade, how did they commute there, just map the news in some ways was the only action we could take. Of course, some students wanted to enter into the rebuilding project, and it was like, no, it's like, let's not rebuild, yeah, it was a huge shift, I think, it was in this period that I think I found the Baltimore work, especially, is this diagram that one of the students did, which is really very open-ended about how you act and where you act and who you act with. And as an architect and urban designer, there's great value in not aligning with a single organization, institution, but finding a way to approach the whole ecosystem. And so this is when I kind of changed my practice. I formed a company called Urban Interface. And so I was really interested in developing a practice that worked with developers, worked with community groups, worked with government research projects, that's been the practice I maintained until very recently when I kind of took on a administrative position at Parsons.
So this is the first exploration of socio-ecological systems.
Yeah.
There's an interface between the city, the underlying ecology, and social systems within it, people of different class.
Yeah, and this is where and I'm having these discussions with Aromar at this point, starting in 2000, about urban metabolism, and those were the conversations that I really benefited from, and actually Graham and I, and then Stuart and I both wrote essays about the meta-city, which is, I'd like to talk about a little bit, but it comes from those discussions and the theorization of the work in Baltimore, which is the theories about patch dynamics. And so how do you operate within a patchy and dynamic system so it's not a city form like Geddes was trying to identify that has a center and a periphery, and you can sort of shape it in a kind of singular way. And so that led to this form. And so this is, my theory of the city, of an architecture of the city is, and what I really like to introduce in broader urban discussions, because I think we talk about different things when we talk about the city. And this is something I became acutely aware of, and I think Laura will love this, when the urban studies people keep on talking about the metropolis, and I'm like, that's a pretty loaded way to describe the city as the metropolis. Isn't that like urban, rural, and native and power? And so I just think we need to be clear about what a city is. And there's a historical moment where a city is geographically limited and can be drawn as an artifact. So in Aldo Rossi, Italian, so he's looking at Padua when he writes the architecture of the city. And so, or Colin Rowe is Munich. And so it's a city of a certain scale where it can be drawn in detail. The whole city can be drawn in detail, and its food source and water source is immediately apparent to the citizens of the city, and there's no hidden power structure or agenda. You know who's ruling, you know where the food's coming from, you know where the shit goes. And but the metropolis is this construction of using technology, train stations, sanitary systems, nature as parks, rural people separated from urban people, so there's an architecture of the city we describe, but then the metropolis produces the metropolitan architect. And so when Rem Koolhaas starts his project, it's called the Office of Metropolitan Architecture. Yep. So the weird architecture has this moment, and it's a revival of a kind of status of architecture that comes from the colonial city in the Paris Opera House.
Actually, interestingly, almost at the same time, maybe, a little bit earlier, in 2002, we start working here on this big sustainable urban design competition, which the Japanese put out. $1 million prize at the end of it, people from across the world, 100 cities competing in it. And then we 2003 in Tokyo with this sort of frame that comes from Goa.
Yeah.
But the the untold story of that frame was that we actually started with Mumbai. So the interesting story there was that we had, the brief was
Too big.
yes, well, 100 years strict form transition to sustainability.
Yeah.
We started in Mumbai because Rahul, who's now
Right.
at the GSC at Harvard, was basically the guy who worked on the city. And then when we started to do the maths and we started to do
Yeah.
the design with Sanjay, etc., we found it was impossible.
Yeah.
And that is exactly the challenge of the metropolis, because
Yeah.
it's driven by the 19th century infrastructure, especially Bombay, and 20th century energy systems, which sort of underpin that. And those are big question marks that no longer work in the current environment. So then we said, okay, this is too complex, can't be done. Let's move to a place that has a better chance of making this happen. And from that came urbanism, and that whole engagement
Yep.
between the rural and the urban,
Yep.
which works in certain contexts.
Yep.
And then, how do you keep the balance between different scales, which in some senses, so, you look at the entire scale dynamics that operate.
Yeah.
And South Asia is very particular in that that sense, because we still have alive, unlike what the Chinese are doing just now.
Yeah.
Everything from, as you can see, and it will probably come up in the curve that you have, from the small town,
Yeah.
10,000 people, all the way up to the mega urban region, 30 million people. That's what Mumbai, Pune, Nasik, that's what sort of all Delhi is all about. So understanding the dynamics of these of scale and how that plays out in form, function, and of course the metabolism of the process, because what's driving this is energy systems below that, and the flow of water, especially in South Asia, main constraint, and by and even today our cities have so much of steel in Delhi, for example, is still moved by bullock cart at night. So that's interesting. High intensity material in terms of energy is moved using biomass driven systems. So that's a interesting.
Yeah,
sort of-
so each of these, there's city models, each one has a kind of different role and power structure of the architecture of the city, and a different role of nature, different kind of social and power project. And the Metropolitan Project is really one of really controlling those boundaries between nature and culture and urban and rural and seen and unseen and the class structures and things like that of the bourgeois city. And doing the Transparent City Project, it was really interesting that in the map collection of every map of New York City in the New York Public Library, you reach a point where the city is too big to map in the kind of to see the architecture and the city as a whole. And so they become very schematic. They're road maps. They're not city maps at some point. And so the megalopolis is something where, what is the architecture of the megalopolis? Of course, it's driven by transportation infrastructures and the U.S. It's highway, the interstate highway system, and all sorts of telecommunication thing, newspapers. I mean, John Gottman talks about the newspaper circulations, TV broadcasts, things between Boston, New York, and Washington, and it's actually Route 1. It's not the interstate system that ties it all together. But it's not even a single city, but it's a conurbation, a cluster of cities with a kind of rank and hierarchical order and specialization of the U.S. government and knowledge economy and finance. But it's really questionable what the role of the architect is, or what the architecture of the megalopolis is, and this is where landscape begins and planning begin to take a much more assertive role in shaping and forming the city at this point, and especially traffic and transportation engineers. And so the architecture of the city becomes a traffic engineering project as opposed to a cultural project. And the megacity, as we talked about, the auto
construction, which is
the
the primary
city.
mode of production,
Yeah.
throughout much of Asia,
Yeah.
certainly in our part of the world. I mean, that's like 95%, 98%.
Yeah. In some ways, it's returned to the city because everything is apparent: food production, water cycles, things like that. But it's still unresolved. Who's designing that city, or when a designer comes in, what's the role of participation versus leadership towards? And so. So if landscape and planning and engineering come in here, of course, the social research becomes really extremely important. So finally, the discussion about metabolism led to a question of the metacity. It's because the way UN looks at things, these are all scale, and for us, they're more about metabolism and actors, and there are different kinds of models or conceptions of the city, and different forms of the city. And so the UN, all of a sudden, when the megacity was defined as not the way Janet Perlman was defining it as a self-built city, but as a city of 10 million people, so it lumps Tokyo with Sao Paulo, and it doesn't quite make sense. The metacity, the UN, when it became 20 million, and I said, okay, wait a second, there's got to be something different about, to use this really enticing term of the metacity. And so this is where also digital technology comes in. And so the idea of the metacity is that can we go back to cities within the city? That it isn't like trying to create a cohesive metropolitan or megalopolitan vision of the city, but that each fragment or patch of the city is a city within the city, and it's it's some of the rural urban spaces. It's within a highly dense condition, but each has its own.
And it uses a fractal dynamic.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the one fundamental difference
Yeah.
in terms of the underlying process. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just a way of saying, oh, can we all be talking about the same thing? And so so it's just the beginning, but interesting to just look at Bangalore through this lens. And so I found a couple of old maps. So this is when Bangalore's a city. I mean, because it has a wall.
Yeah, it's a small.
It has a forest.
Earthen wall and
Yeah,
whatever
yeah.
it is. Yeah.
And there's another map I didn't include, but you can see the tanks and the water supply and the food supply that surrounds this, easily traversed city and knowable city, and easy to see who's in control, and gates control the flows of what's going in and out and can be taxed and monitored, but then, of course, when the British come in, we see the metropolis. The train comes in, the classification of different groups where they live in the city, different systems of institutional organization within the city, whether it's the military or the
what we call the civil
knowledge.
and military state.
Yeah. And so, Bangalore has cities within the city, but has this colonial metropolitan structure, which is still recognizable. And then, now we're, kind of trying to understand it as a megacity and a megalopolis at the same time. And so the forces of informal, whether housing or economic activity, but then the formal sector being engaged in this huge infrastructure development project, which is not just the city, but it's linking all the cities of India according to corridors and economic development agendas. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about Bangalore.
Well, I guess it's not so much Bangalore itself. It's a question of both the imagination and the practice.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you look at this city or a whole set of other things here from the South Asian perspective, there are a number of things that strike. The first thing is the centrality of informality and auto construction.
Mm-hmm.
So the difference between Manhattan and then Shanghai and parts of Hong Kong. Hong Kong itself, or even earlier Singapore, was quite different. There was a remarkable degree of informality in some senses, and an auto construction inside it. So the question is, one of the questions is, what are the key drivers and what are the plans that people are actually working to? Are there discernible schemes inside this, institutional or architectural, or that actually drive this kind of process? And I think one way to frame it is that, as the West developed, or at least sort of Western Europe developed, a lot of the technologies in the urban form were driven by a deep scarcity of capital. And the way the technologies evolved was in response to that. And that's how you get certain kinds of, let's say, late 18th and 19th century forms, whether it comes out from London, Chicago, and then, whatever it is. Here, we had two other things. And this is an old debate that I've had with Arjun. You essentially have something which has been lost, at least I mean, it never existed in some sense, so it was wiped out in North America. It's still there in Europe. You have an agrarian landscape, which is the material condition, but you also have a sacred landscape that connects up all these dots. And it's a fairly stable structure because it's been there for sometimes 1,000 or 1,500 years, because the modes of production have not changed very much. Terms of trade have changed a bit, but not very much. And the means of interchange, even though they were not constructed in the nation state form that we see all the thing in. So both those things. So you have underlying that, and it still applies in India. And you can see the cities and towns as a sacred landscape. That's how people see it. That's how they experience it. Many of them see it that way, and that's tied to an agrarian landscape. And then you find that agrarian landscape starting to change. In starting, I guess, in the 17th and 18th century, and very much so in the 19th century, when you find new technologies and new forms of extraction and production taking place. So it's not only the question of the colonial and what comes to us from Greece and Rome and that whole tradition that was created and sort of constructed through the Renaissance. It's also a whole range of other contexts where the village and the older urban traditions are sort of are in deep tension with the colonial metropolis. So the question here of the imagination of Mumbai and how Mumbai grew, what it was before the American Civil War and the cotton boom, and what happened afterwards. And you can see that even now, if you look at Bombay from satellite imagery, you can see the docks and how they're constructed. So it's an artificial construction, but that was limited to that period of globalization. What we often forget is that we go back to Janet and stuff like that. Even the late 19th century globalization is probably third in a sequence depending on where you actually start. And there's a long history of that process. The world system came together, and India was very much part of the world. It was actually one of the significant poles at that point.
Well, I love her quote, it's on the way to everywhere. I mean,
yes, exactly.
China is the middle kingdom in the center of the world, but India is on the way to everywhere.
Yeah, and of course the question of where India is, etc. That's the sort of core question there. So you can see that tension playing itself out across this landscape. You have an older agrarian landscape, you have new technologies and new flows actually taking place, and major paths. And Bangalore is very interesting because it's created out of sort of a conflict of two major colonial paths sitting at the background, the French and the British. So it's an outcome of that global engagement at that point of time, late 18th century, where the French actually lost, and whatever it is, closing out with Napoleon much later, and our own systems of management and governance. So this was a space which was a space that was very sophisticated in its use of water, because it was a space of tanks and agriculture and fairly sophisticated systems of production. I mean, this is the center for silk and other forms of manufacture, quite advanced. There was a lot of export of things from this region. And then you come in with a military regime post Napoleonic wars, which essentially sets this up as a cantonment and a place for rest, recreation, recuperation for troops who can't handle what's happening.
Well, you're setting me up for Bangkok pretty well.
Exactly. So, I mean, it's a similar kind of story here, starting in the mid 1850s. And then you jump 100 years later, and then you find a new wave of globalization, and this then gets hyperlinked. Starting in the, exactly the same time, 1990s onwards, starting to become hyperlinked into this new world, in which, in a sense, because of fiber optics and a whole range of other things, the theory is that the world is flat. In actual fact, it's deeply unequal. And it's deeply unequal because you do not see the underlying layers of asymmetry and informality and other modes of production, which are not legitimate in a world which is driven by capital. So, all of these things are happening and sort of defining these spaces, and you can see them. And I think the beautiful thing about, or the challenging thing about Indian cities, and the way we try and sort of explain it, is you have the pre-colonial, you have the colonial, you have the sort of, whatever, post-colonial Indian mixed up in between the period that we lived through. And then you have the sort of post-industrial connection, all happening in the same place. You can walk 100 meters from one to the other, and you can go from the well, in Bangalore, maybe from the mid-17th century to the 21st. So both space and time are convoluted. They're fractally connected. But our tools of being able to understand them and engage with them are actually fairly poor.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and I think you're really. I'm going to race through Bangkok now to sort of get to the juicy stuff at the end, which is the futures. But it's I think that these different kinds of city models that are presented exist in time, and some cities get frozen. Like Siena will always be a city.
Many
only
Indian
a
cities
city,
are like that. I
right?
mean, our classic cities are
Yeah,
like that.
and Paris, of course, is frozen in its metropolitan grandeur. And but Bangalore and certainly Bangkok, which I'm going to talk about now, didn't go through a sequential historical cycle of city metropolis. In fact, it went from city to megacity and has pieces of metropolis, and then building the megalopolis starts to achieve a kind of metropolitan life to it at this point, which I'm going to race through really quickly now. So sacred city, of course, is a sacred city. Bangkok is just the kind of nickname of the city, and anyone there will call it Krongthep Nakhon. But this is the full name. It's the great city of angels, the residence of emerald, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it was built.
This is very interesting because we've forgotten this way of naming in India. This is
Yeah.
the full name of.
If you want to see an Indic city, go to Bangkok.
Yeah.
Really operating. And so this is half of the argument of the India-China legacies. There's a whole another thing about capitalism arriving in Bangkok, which is the China story. But I'm focusing on the Indic story today. So even though it's an 18th century, it's a 17th. It's at the Enlightenment. It's built as an ancient sacred city and according to Indic models. Its space is conceived cosmologically in a different kind of sense of time. And there's three worlds: one with form and sense, one without sense and form, and without form but only sense, and one without sense and form. And so, it really is a key in that these aren't historical successions. These are different layers of reality that if you think about overlaying my schematic diagram of different kinds of city models on the cosmological model, you understand these strange juxtapositions.
Yeah, this city as Tantra. I mean, this is exactly.
Yeah, of hyper-modernity next to, and consumption next to, complete Buddhist asceticism. So, and so this is the sacred city, Rattanakosin, with the blank space of originally the front palace and the grand palace, the big white zones, and the space in between is the grass for the funerary monument to be built, and the river is the sacred river, cut. The meander was the old course of the river that goes through Tamberi, but this is a shortcut that's cut that creates this island city. And the rituals, of course, come from Hindu Brahmanism and
yeah, this is Ayutthaya.
Yeah.
In a different context and setting. In fact, in two translations separated, because there were two other capitals before this.
Yeah. And so even these ships were salvaged from Ayutthaya after the Burmese sacked the city, and the sacred city was reconstructed in Bangkok. Wat Po, and this is the tonsorial temporary structure that's built.
This is early 20th century choreography.
Yeah. This is actually
100 years old.
Rama V's tonsorial structure when he's a teenager and gets his knot cut. And his father's funerary monument, Mongut's Rama IV's temporary structure built on outside the Grand Palace before cremation for the 100 days of mourning. The Brahma swing, which a kind of canceled ritual given the fatalities when the swing got too out of control. So it's an amazing and intact, pre-colonial, but also a country that wasn't colonized. So somehow this has persisted. The Grand Palace is still the palace of a living king, and which is respected in a completely uncynical way as maintaining that cosmic order. And then, of course, Bangkok has a very, very specific colonial and Cold War legacy in that it stayed between, like Bangalore, caught between the French and the British, and isn't colonized, but then becomes
In between the Soviet Union and the States.
but becomes the toehold of the U.S. and the
exactly.
basically the air base for the bombings of
So Saigon on one side,
Yeah.
Hanoi on the other, and Bangkok. That's where,
yeah. So the city has a soft coup. I mean, it's a kind of an elite. Well, first of all, there's a modernization project. I'm sorry, King, who travels to all the colonies. He goes to Indonesia and Singapore, but then goes to Europe on his grand tour and starts to make the metropolis as a kind of personal project for relocating his palace from the Grand Palace in the center of the city to the Dusit Palace, which is a more garden suburban palace. So the kind of structure that you saw the British were building in the colonies gets replicated as a crypto or semi-colonial system within Thailand. And so this is a really important space. So the funerary grounds, Sanam Luang gets extended and becomes this boulevard system that in the middle point here gets modernized after the revolution to create Democracy Monument. And so this space is both created by the king for his pomp and celebration. You can see when he returns from Europe, they build all these triumphal arches for him, Rome, and through Paris, through and
but these are temporary, see?
they're temporary.
That's
yeah, like the funerary thing.
Exactly, but that's one of the differences between Asia, because in Rome or even in Paris, it would come out as a stone structure.
Yeah.
And we have the same thing in New Delhi. If you look at India Gate, that's a reflection of the
Sure.
same thing. For us, these are things in time.
Yeah.
And it's like temples. Temples are never frozen in time.
And so this is the Democracy Monument that gets built as a symbol of a kind of democracy that wasn't universally embraced. It was an elite who were creating this constitutional monarchy. And becomes the site where real democratic movements begin. So 1974 was the student revolt, which because Thammasat University, which was created by the coup makers as the alternative university to Chulalongkorn, the Royal University of Political Science, is created this, against 74. And
so this is very interesting, because if you reflect now on what we've seen in Cairo, for example, this is 74, 70, and Vietnam, I mean, the pullout was 75, 76.
Well, it's following this coup that all the American Air Force bases were closed because it was one of the results of the progressiveness of this.
Yeah, so you see a radicalization of the students in the university and actually how that changes.
And this one is 92, which is described as a more middle class protest and including the first use of video of it. And so there's this kind of representation of morbidity and death that comes from this, and the mediatization of the protest. Again, you saw my timeline of the 90s. And then it comes closer to Chulalongkorn. So in this, when the king adds this new palace district, the Dusit to the north, this was the district for the crown prince, who died in Windsor Palace, like in Bangalore's right here, and that becomes property of the university. And so this old palace, which was connected by the canal to the as a recreation, a cool spot in a hot summer afternoon to bring the royal family, and is all crown property just east of the royal city. And that becomes the real center of globalization. And what's interesting is that the protests eventually moved from the site of national identity to the site of globalization. And so, so in this historical overlay, you can see Windsor Palace, which is now the National Stadium. And on the old rice field, so the red are royal family palaces. This is the Crown Princess's palace right here. And the properties that the king gives to the prince and princesses were, self-supporting rice fields that are now lease sites to large developers for shopping malls and commercial buildings. And the university itself's endowment is in land, and so it's the first builder of a shopping complex called Siam Square. So I don't have time to do the whole history of shopping in Bangkok, but that was the project where I brought this skyscraper, kind of looking at a building through time and understanding the history. We looked at this district with the students at Chulalongkorn University, and I described this as a kind of Darwinian struggle. Each shopping mall that replaces the next displaces the previous. Because it's all carved. There's huge boulevards in this kind of modern extension of the city. You can only go to one because there's too much traffic to go to two. And so the newest one kind of kills the old one. The old one becomes more low end, and you can never walk on the street between the two because even the half a kilometer walk is too hot, too polluted. You can't cross the street. 1997, the financial crisis, all these properties are in bankruptcy. The Crown property, the university is in fiscal crisis, but the city manages to build the first 2 lines of the SkyTrain, which somehow by chance converge in the Crown property.
Well, they have the games also, the Asian games.
Yeah, and so this is like Grand Central, Siam Central Station here, where the 2 lines come together. And what was really interesting is how a kind of a new public realm was developed on the 2nd level, connecting the SkyTrain system with the commercial buildings below. And so I hope you can see it here in red. It sort of appears piece by piece. And then the new malls that get built after the recovery turn the mall inside out. Instead of having atrium and vertical escalators on the inside and blank buildings of department stores around, the department stores buried on the inside, and all that vertical circulation is on display from the SkyTrain. And so it's absolutely spectacular space. So again, it was a more complicated history than the history of capitalism, because it's this cosmological space. This is royal property, and the Royal University that's leased to Chinese capital, like Thai Chinese capitalists who are building these structures on 15-year leases, and so they have to rebuild them every 15 years. So it's a slightly different story, but quite interesting. And so this is from beneath. You can see this whole armature. So the first time there's actually a kind of cosmopolitan culture of people walking between these malls and encountering each other in a kind of public space. It is, some of it is officially public, some of it is privately owned public space, and it extends inside the buildings, in terms of the atriums and walkways, and it's quite an amazing and unusual line of connectivity that continues to grow to this day. And here's the timeline where you can really follow. Basically, it's the Shinawatra era that follows the financial crisis of 1997, creating a consumer culture in Thailand as a way out of the economic crisis. And it was the excuse, you can play the video, was to create a new kind of drawing to describe this kind of space.
You can play
the video? Yeah. Yeah, or can I click it? Yeah. Ah, great, thank you. Quite get online. This is accompanied by a series of videos because the market is operating at every scale because these big malls with the global retail operators are operating within a time structure that's preceded by informal vending that's allowed to occupy the space before they open and after they close. And so we have video analysis of all this sort of temporality of this space that the students did over several years as well. So the timeline is historical, but also daily and
This
seasonal.
is interesting because, I mean, we have similar but somewhat different kind of things that are happening, and similar kinds of movements at the urban design scale, some imaginations like this, but not this kind of analytical frame. You know, it's not our future, but many of the elements, it's like almost like a Meccano or Lego kit.
Yeah, because your two lines aren't connected yet, I'm really wondering what's going to happen in
how it's going to play itself out.
So I'm happy to come here for the next 10 years and do a workshop every year to follow the progression, you know. And these are the two junctions, and then this is in fact the one where the red shirts occupied, but this is also the period that when these buildings are connected to mass transit and creating this new kind of cosmopolitan space is also when the cell phone and the internet and social media comes in. So each of these renovations of shopping complexes is tied to a website, a blog. Korean pop singers are coming to this mall today. Make sure you come and join MBK group, and it's interesting, you know, the languages of each of these websites. And also that the cell phone comes in at this point. So oh, I'm at Starbucks, but I'm at Starbucks too, but oh, you're at the other Starbucks. And so people start to,
so that very
especially
fluid,
young people, you know, socialize in a completely new way.
The fluid kinetic structure, but it follows a different temporality, because even for us, our cities are very fluid, you know, so like Rahul said.
Yeah.
I mean, the kinetic city is really, along with the informality and the auto construction are central elements in this process. And the question then is, what is static and what is dynamic? But here you sort of, there's a new synchronicity that emerges because of the cell phone. Because you can get out if you have the resources, or if you look, and then you can explore that in that entire space, because now the mobility potentially allows you to do that. The challenge, of course, in our cities, unlike this, is that our mobility systems actually don't allow you to do that. They actually are, in some senses, the great frictional resistance to this kind of stuff happening. So the question is, what kind of form, what kind of engagement, what kind of metabolism, what forms of governance emerge from the interaction of those technologies? Because we do have the cell phone, we do have social media, and we have FM, and to some extent now we don't have, like in Bangkok, we don't necessarily have the four-wheeler as much as the two-wheeler, which is, in a sense, what partially constrains this thing. But I guess both form and function might emerge somewhat differently here, especially because, let's say in Bangalore, we said yesterday, is more like a velodrome. You know, it's quite different from Bangkok in this sense.
Yeah, and so even the buildings themselves become mediated and less about architectures of facades and more about you know, Times Square-like displays as well. And I just wanted to show this because the temple is still in the middle of this complex of shopping malls on the SkyTrain. And you can still go there to meditate. It's a forest temple. It was built outside the city for a retreat for the royal family to meditate. And so you can still
you see 100-year discount.
And if you go before the SkyTrain starts and the screeching wheel, it's quiet and you're there meditating, and then all of a sudden, you know, you hear the screeching of the wheel outside. But the frieze around the attic of the temple is the boats from Ayutthaya. So you're sort of sitting in this space where the SkyTrain is spinning and the boats, and you're meditating, so the world is spinning. And so it's all co-present. It's not that one has left the other gone and in the past. And so, and the under the SkyTrain is an interior, and shade is the thing you try to provide an exterior space in a tropical city. So it's quite amazing. And so here's the cell phone. So we can understand why first the yellow shirts, but then when they were really trying to bring down 2006 Thaksin Shinawatra, they were out in Democracy Monument for months and months and months. Nothing was happening. They decided to move.
You know this the red versus yellow shirt story.
So these are the royalists. So
Yeah, the royalists.
So they moved to this space, and they shut down the government in 3 days. He dissolved parliament in 3 days after they moved. You know, so it wasn't this space of nationalism is purely symbolic. It's a kind of ghost space when you go there even today. It's only decorated for royal events and processions, and so this really was the effective political space. And I know Vicky has color work, things like that, so I'm sure you appreciate it. And then the red shirts. And
which is rural,
really,
outside Bangkok.
yeah.
Whole,
so the rural really occupied this in a more a substantive way in a much longer duration. And when the yellow shirt seized power without a popular election. And that's the one that resulted in 90 deaths and violence, and in fact the the barricades.
Yeah, you can see the barricades. It's back to Paris and something.
Yeah, it's the first. It precedes occupied by a couple of years, but they ended up burning the mosque.
But these are the royal malls.
Yeah. Well, it was only one of the developers. This is the central group, and so, I mean, and this is where the China story comes in, because these are Chinese Thai
capital.
rice merchants who became the bankers and the capitalists. And see, and they're huge exporter of food products to China at this point.
So this is a very powerful image for gutted mall, not because of capitalism, but because of a contest between a rural, agrarian, non-metropolitan kind of constituency.
It was quite a shock for Thai, which has been used to more gentle protests, other than 74 and 92, which had violent military responses. And but this building has been recently completed. It didn't take long for the economy to come back. This is, crazy, weird architecture, in its most spectacular way. This central embassy on the land that the British embassy didn't need anymore, so got to keep up their good work in Thailand. And again, so this is extending further east along that axis. And this is a building called Mahanakorn, which is designed by OMA. It's also under construction, the tallest building in Bangkok, next to the SkyTrain. And it's interesting because it's called Mahanakorn, which is the royal sacred name of the city, part of the royal sacred name of the city, Kumtep Mahanakorn. And OMA translated as, Mahanakorn means metropolis. And so when I read the news article that the designers of this building from the Office of Metropolitan Architecture were thinking of this as a metropolitan project, but they mistranslated. I would translate Mahanakorn as meta city. I mean, because that's really what the meta city is. It's above and beyond the physical city. It really is this other kind of cosmological order of the city. So it's quite an interesting building, and this is that train system that is currently under construction, not at the speed of Shanghai, but it's actually picking up steam. And so one wonders, given the kind of density and congestion and political contestation that resulted from these two lines, just two like little segments of the system, focusing on the center, what kind of city this will produce.
It's really interesting. It's like an inverse Haussmann.
Yeah.
Because Haussmann designed so that you could run
right.
the cavalry and
right.
the artillery rounds down the thing.
This blocks everything.
So in fact, even for us, whenever there are political protests in New Delhi, like we had about 2 years ago, one of the critical means of actually controlling this is by shutting down the metro station. Right? I mean, that's how. But then you can't necessarily, of course, we don't have enough lines there, but if you have enough lines, then you have flash mobs that actually go around, because you can't shut down the entire thing, you can't shut down the metropolis in the city. So you then have a whole range of interesting contests in both time and space, because the citizen has the power of the cell phone and, Twitter and whatever it is now. So the people trying to control it, let's say the palace, so to speak, have quite an interesting time trying to figure out how to deal with the movements in space and whatever.
Okay, now we're getting to the last thing we really wanted to throw out here as uncertain futures. Suvarnabhumi. So
That's the airport in Bangkok.
but also
Yes. Yeah.
it's it's the Indic name for the golden land of Southeast Asia before Europe arrives, and so the king, it's named the airport Suvarnabhumi, and so there is this idea that this region, which colonialism and the Cold War has deeply divided, is at a moment now where it can be reconnected. And through the airport, of course, is one of the first means. And at the same time, is Paravir, which is the Khmer temple, which topographically is on the Thai side of the Thai-Cambodia border. But when the French drew the border between French Indochina and Thailand, they included this as a cultural artifact, and then UNESCO with Cambodia made it an application for a world monument without ties. There's only access to it from Thailand, and so there's a bit of a tension. So at the same time, there's this legacy of a kind of unified world, but then the colonial borders and UNESCO is creating this kind of political tension of territorialization and reigniting kind of Cold War adversaries. So we're a little bit out of sequence because of my crash, but this is Arrighi's stages of the long 20th century and the succession of empire. And so you go from the British to the American, and speculating, drawing on this map to the next, the long 21st century, and what's the hegemonic power, and basically it's a period of stability of a world system, but then there's this period of transition and turbulence as powers shift across the globe, and so Bangkok was the kind of outpost of capitalism and U.S. ally, surrounded by Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia, and which is all those three countries are now opening up their borders as for the first time in decades. And it's interesting that it's Suvarnabhumi and this boutique airline, Bangkok Airways, that starts to be the first way of connecting this old golden land before the colonies. And so Siem Reap, which means Siam defeated in Khmer. So the city where Angkor Wat is named, its modern name is the defeat of Siam.
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting. But then I got interested in Zipf's law. So here it is. So Zipf's law, that basically a country's largest city is followed by half-size population of two second largest cities by 4.
Yeah, it's a log plot, yeah.
So you can see there's more and more cities as you go along this, and the population halves at each point. And so it's an incredible progression in New York, and you can see where there aren't the political boundaries that cities sort in this hierarchical way of small cities and big cities, and an incredible almost straight line. And Bangkok was always called a primate city, like 10 times larger than Chiang Mai, the second largest city. And so I said, that doesn't make sense because that's Thailand, and it's really Suvarnabhumi. There's probably a Zipf's law there. So, so the legacy, the pre-colonial legacy, is before European hegemony. And so here we can see India with its two coasts and two arenas, as Janet Abu-Lughal describes them, the Arabian Sea and the Andaman Sea. And then, China extending down to Southeast Asia and the South China Sea. And so you can see how important Southeast Asia was in the and it's interesting, in her map of the first world system before European hegemony, and this is 13th century system, doesn't of course have the Western Hemisphere. It's not, and so Wallerstein says it's not a world system because it doesn't have the hemisphere. But when Peter Taylor does the first world city map, and you know, long before Sassius Sasson, it's based on airline connectivity. So the numbers of flights between cities, and he generates this series of maps. And it's quite interesting that India and China, and this is 1985, don't appear. They have no cities that are world cities, according to that global connectivity.
Some people have not discovered Shanghai there.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's just 30 years ago. And again, like when I became an architect, and you know, so this is this legacy, you know, I mean, at a global scale, that kind of Cold War and what cities get connected to the global system and what don't. And so the update of this would be quite interesting. And so, in addition to this tourist project of Suvarnabhumi and connecting the pre-colonial sites and cities, there's also the logistics of making, as this map proclaims, Bangkok the new hub or gateway of the East. And so if Singapore kind of has had that role because of the Straits of Malacca historically, Thailand has always been trying to figure out how to build a canal to be the center of trade between India and China. But now it's through land and sea logistical connection. So the north-south, Kunming to Singapore, and then the east-west, Chennai to Dawei, which is a straight shot from Bangkok, you know, closer to Bangkok than to Yangon, and then across to Ho Chi Minh City or Phnom Penh. So this, and you know, in Siam, this is Angkor Wat, Angkor Thom. And actually, I had this up there just as a reminder of what they're discovering, that this is a deeply rural city. It's a city that is all about a water network to urban villages that are linked to the urban center and the retention of water. Okay, so this is the nighttime map I wanted to get to. So what you can see is Cambodia, the dark space, that's Siem Pen, Laos, Luang Prabang, and Myanmar, Yangon there. And then Bangkok, this incredible megalopolis extending down the east coast, and then highways connecting the cities of the northeast, which is a plateau, and the cities of the north, which are Mountain Valley, Chiang Mai up there. And so the Cold War boundary, of course, is visible from space. And so if you think about that, Dawei is just a few miles east of Bangkok, and Siem Reap is a few miles west, and Siem Reap is a few miles west. So that's Siem Reap, and that's Dawei, and that's Bangkok. So, and if you play out Zipf's law, you're gonna see a kind of urbanization, a regional urbanization, and that's what I wanted to speculate on. So this is, which again was occupied by the yellow shirts, and which was a real political disaster for them, because that was not kosher to cut down that global connectivity, because it disrupted tourism, and it was just an incredible mistake. And that, of course, when you go into the airport, the first thing after you go through and check in is
Samudra Manthan.
See
That's big.
the seas
You don't
of
find
milk.
it even in India very, very often.
Yeah, and of course it's the gateway to Angkor Thom, and it's the murals of Angkor Wat are reproduced in Suvarnabhumi Airport. So, and then this regional connectivity is coinciding with flood vulnerability in the Bangkok region, and so this is where the agricultural urban mix becomes important. Everything red here is green because it's infrared. These are the rice paddies east of Bangkok. These are the fruit orchards west of Bangkok, all canal-based system. And Bangkok is diked, and so it's flood protected, and these are conceived as monkey cheeks. They can absorb the excess flood water. But the capitalists decided that they were also cheap land for industrial estates. And so this is where, before the flood of 2010, 65% of the hard drives were produced in this area. Huge, the Detroit of the East automobile production. And so this is the flood of 2010. And you can see the city wasn't flooded. Suvarnabhumi has the same kind of hydrological protection as Angkor Wat, a 3-dike, 2 canal, quite amazingly, and it stayed dry and open throughout the flood. There's Suvarnabhumi, stayed dry and open throughout the flood, even though it's in the middle of the monkey cheek. And there's the Honda factory after the waters receded. That's all clay that looks like snow. This is not Detroit after a snowstorm. And so we did a survey because Denai Paitaku and my colleagues at Jewel and Cornell, the way we've been monitoring the infrastructure change in the center of the city, we've been looking at the ring road, the industrial ring road that extends around the city, which is a kind of, speaking of Geddes, it's the same perimeter of London, green belt, but extended north. And so what I began to do now is a kind of genealogy of the industrial estate in the periphery. And so what we discovered is they're not like China, that they were bought and developed at one time, but they have a history of accretion. So you just grow the industrial. This is Rojana, where the Honda factory was, which is right here, and it's industrial states. And we have the historical maps of how it grew, rice paddy by rice paddy. You just keep on buying a farmer out. And this is the canal that goes right into the main gate of Ayutthaya, the island city. And so if you're on this canal, you're in a 500-year-old landscape. And you live there and you worked in this very porous factory district was just it's just instead of a rice field. And so it's a little bit like the Veneto in Italy, if you know that farmers just did small industrial buildings within, and you know, Benetton and Diesel, all these companies sort of came from that. Quite fascinating, but what's happening now is the fortification of it. So, so JICA is in there building what I say is temporary flood control. So this is, again, the wall city coming back. And just to protect, because the technology is going to only last for 10 years of how they're doing these hard drives and the car technology that they're building. So it's just until the port is built in Cambodia, in Burma, and the factories, the garment industry has already been moved to Cambodia from Thailand. So so the Japanese are the ones who are kind of scouting out and funding a lot of this infrastructure, and so it's where the labor's cheap, where the land might be drier, and so so that's a kind of semi-vision of the future. So it's a legacy story that is so embedded into Indian-China story, and but its future is completely tied to those two countries as well.
So if you were to try and pull out a few things that are there, this is an old conversation again with Arjun. If you look at it over the long view, if you look at the Arigi view, etc., and you look at it from the spatio-temporal perspective, what you have deeply embedded in this is essentially land waterscapes. Bangkok is a fantastic example of it.
Yeah.
It depends on where you come from. Some people look at it as agrarian landscape, which is about land and whatever. Bangalore is a huge anomaly because you don't have megacities building up where there is no water. So that's an exception. If you look at the whole set of 30, 40 megacities, there's just a few of them. There's Mexico City, there's this, etc. Most of them are situated around water. So they're actually mixed land waterscapes. And the methods and systems of management and control are deeply embedded in cultural tradition and, of course, in legal process. So how that works out is deeply cultural. And obviously, if we try and impose, and we're doing some very interesting work here on looking at revenue systems. If you impose, let's say, a Western legal system on that framework, you have very interesting context. So underlying that, the water landscapes tied into each other. Within it, of course, you have a historical system of settlement, which were based on those modes of production, which still exist today. You find them in urban villages. Of course, you find them in the living environment. That's what produces much of the food. You've sort of modernized it in some ways by using modern technology, green revolution, GM, all the new stuff that's coming. But essentially, the landscape is not. And then you start in the mid 19th century, bringing in. So you're moving from the city of wood to the city of coal. So that's the 19th century wave that you see the large colonial cities emerging, Bangkok being one of them, but in this region, of course, Calcutta being the big city of that time, essentially controlling the trade with China, the Opium Wars, and all stuff that happened, and then Mumbai coming around, commodities essentially. So still agrarian, but based on industrial production, based on those commodities. Textiles being the thing that actually connects them. Textiles really being the thing that was traded apart from pottery and high sort of luxury goods. That's the thing that really enabled this trading system to operate. And then from that come the railways, the telegraph, new forms of communication, and in some senses, at least for our environment, it's, I guess, a little bit different from Southeast Asia. Probably not so much for Vietnam. Is the construction of the nation state coming simultaneously with that? India is a hypothesis in some sense. It is a new idea that emerged, let's say, less than 100 years ago. Because this is a patchwork of lots of different other, cultures, linguistic and political. And then you come with the construction of the nation state with this idea of these new geographies. Some of them that are driven by particular identities, could be religious, ethnic, linguistic, etc. Which again is quite different and over a foreshortened period compared to what happened in Europe and certainly what happened in North America. So cities have a very important part in this process because at least in South Asia, of democratic politics actually emerges from urban areas and not from rural areas. There was a history of other forms of engagement, but often, patrilineal and whatever it is. So the construction of the nation state and how you actually put it together and how you link the metropolises became a very important part of that process and part of the nation building process. And that's why in India, post-independence, you have the construction of the Chandigarhs of the world, which is a new sites of power because there's a new organization around linguistic sort of identity, and simultaneously the construction of the new industrial towns.
And it's interesting in terms of the schema that I presented. I was thinking about Chandigarh, and it's like a metropolis without a city. We have some cities that never had their metropolis and become mega cities without an infrastructure.
The funny thing is, if you look at the satellite images of Chandigarh, you actually see Chandigarh being swallowed by the informal city.
Right.
So India, in a sense, has struck back at Corbusier.
Yes.
And you can see that happening over the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It's sort of ingested by that system. That's what's sort of underlying that. So you move then from the city of coal to the city of oil. And you can see that in New York with 72 and 79 and whatever it is, and OPEC, and we're going through the same thing just now, and a new form of much more regional sort of urban engagement happening. But much slower in this part of the world because we have been seriously constrained in terms of oil. That's the story of South Asia. But in other areas, you get the creation of Singapore, you create the creation of Dubai, and of course, the Chinese miracle starts happening around, let's say, the flow of this energy. Some coal, but a lot of oil. I think one of the core questions for us is, as we move forward, how do these energy systems, how do these flows of water, of energy, as we move to renewables? The fascinating thing about renewables we're sort of dealing with here and trying to get a handle of is that renewables are about decentralization. Because renewable energy is throughout the landscape. It's actually, in the morning we had a very interesting conversation about the fact that there's not only energy above the ground, in metropolitan systems, there's a colleague of who's just looking at London, and what she's finding is in going from the old city of Westminster all the way up to Heathrow, if you look at the ground energy that's available, there's a tremendous amount of waste heat that's there that actually can be used to do a lot of the heating for the city. Yeah. So there's energy below and there's energy above. It's distributed.
Yeah.
So the architectures and in a sense the geometries that emerge are going to be very different from what you see just now.
Right.
These are historical structures that are there. If you really want to make the carbon transition, which is essential for this not to happen, I mean, this is about precursor climate change and processes like that. So the cities are concentrating this energy. They're concentrating, wealth creation. They're concentrating employment creation in all of them. That's why they're bringing people inside. But they're also concentrating risk, and they're not respecting the lessons that we've learned about managing those waterscapes and landscapes,
Right.
which is what the pre-colonial story is about. In a sense, in some senses, what the sacred landscape is about. I mean, sacred landscape is not only sacred; it is also functional in some sense.
Right.
Yeah. So all of these contradictions simultaneously, and you can see that those disjunctions actually working coterminous, and so coeval in time in Asian cities. And that's why, in a sense, how Asian capitalism develops, how that plays itself out, very nicely shown to us here in Bangkok, I suspect will emerge very differently from the way it does otherwise. And hence, there will be both new theory and new practice that emerge from that.
Yeah.
So the question is, do these kind of hyperlinks that we've seen in Bangkok, how do they translate into, let's say, Hanoi? How would they translate into Kolkata or Dhaka? Yeah. And
well, and the thing that is in crisis now in Southeast Asia is the status of democracy. So it is the military government, martial law is still intact in Thailand, and so what I learned from the Baltimore work is the watershed model, and what's remarkable about Thailand, be pre-colonial and Asia as a whole, is it's a tributary system, and so there's a kind of political power flow, and that is also based on the flow of material, including water and air and everything, and so. But it's a completely hierarchical serfdom system, and so how do you translate that kind of genius of tying together the political system with the ecological, with a kind of broad democratic engagement with the making of the city? So I think I guess now I'm realizing I'm still stuck in the 90s because I believe this meta city is a way that the village is co-managing the industrial estate in the rice fields, and through a kind of a different kind of structure than that's managed by somewhere in the city, somewhere in this other chain. But so the city within city, and there's a kind of not an anarchical or pre-modern landscape, but there's a kind of other kind of way of structuring the larger agglomerations and decision-making at a larger scale based on infrastructure.
Okay, we've taken an awful lot of time.
Yeah.
People have been awfully patient here. So, yeah, if we can jump into a wider conversation, we should have broken it up.
Yeah.
Brian was in free flow.
Yeah, sorry.
So, we're not frozen to death by all these images and these mad ideas. Maybe you should pick up the mic, yeah? Because otherwise you won't be able to pick it up.
I'm interested in a statement that you made about the Mahanakon when you said that, if I pronounced it correctly, you mentioned that it's co-present and it's still there. Like you see the spiritual idea of that city being formed, and then you see the existing physical form and the networks in some way mirroring that idea. If you could kind of expound on that, because I'm actually interested in that. That's
the first cosmological drawing. Are you referring to?
Yes.
Yeah, the kind of three worlds, and each of those worlds has multiple levels. So it's both a way to imagine that all these city forms are coexisting anywhere in space. Even in Siena, you're on the net, and it's connected to the autostrada, and so but also that form is really important. I mean, I'm an architect, so the city of form, the city of sensation is really important. But there's different kinds of things, and then there's something beyond form and something beyond sensation, and that's a kind of shared worldview that created a kind of very successful urban system, global urban system for centuries, so a shared imagination that's kind of so embedded in ritual and daily life. So I'm just wondering what we can learn from that, even in the modern age. I mean, we have our kind of shared meta symbols and vocabularies and myths and things like that, which tend to be in the hands of people trying to sell things, mostly. So I think that there's got to be a counter narrative, a counter kind of myth, a counter kind of story of what's beyond form, but also a kind of a design project of the senses, and a design project of the form. Form is important, and even at a city that has become so formless and beyond our ability to conceive of as a whole, each of its pieces have the ability to be formed, you know, and really and designed in much better ways, in much more equitable ways, in much more sustainable ways. And so, but I don't know. It's a useful diagram for me, both to understand Bangkok and to think about how to operate within it.
Thank you very much. This is Vicky Hatton talking. I would just like to hear you talk a little bit about your megacities sequencing, which seems to be more, and your recent work on regionalism.
Yeah.
So your earlier work, it seems to me, is much more about time and scale, and that your later work and interests now are really about the relationships across those. But there was less about the relationship side and the regionalism piece in this than I had with you in my talks with you over the last year or so. So I was wondering if you could just talk about that in terms of the legacies and futures.
Yeah, like a deeper description of what's going on?
Not so much that, it's just really about where the regionalism piece, which I know is a very strong interest in yours, and actually deeply tied to the India-China Institute and the relationships that you've had out of that, and the ones that you see in your research and practice. But that wasn't as much in the talk.
Sure.
So this seemed more about sequence and scale, as I understood it, as opposed to kind of flows, relationships, and a regionalism.
Sure. Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could just say a little bit about your strong interest in the regionalism.
So I mean, Aromar asked me to give this lecture when I had a laptop with some material. And so I had the mall story and the protest story as a lecture.
Motif,
and other kind of stuff. But I have the periphery stuff much more developed. And it's been ongoing at the same time as the other research. But with and it's of course, you know, a university that's constructed completely disciplinary, so I have to work with the architects to do the mall stuff, and I have to work with the landscape department to do the regional stuff. And you know, I always try to get them together, and so with you know success when there's like a workshop situation, but then everyone goes back to their corners. So there's, you know, a survey of this entire ring road, which has been built over a few decades. And the first Honda motorcycle factory is there, as well as this first industrial estate, and different kinds of farming practices, and different kinds of even highway engineering It goes in and out of Bangkok Metropolitan Administration, which have different building codes, and so the buildings get built outside versus inside. So what I, in both projects, you see they're big infrastructural systems that are instituting huge change. But as an architect, I'm very interested in, that world of form and sense at a particular moment in that's affected by it. And so this mass transit system in the last map that you saw is extremely vast, and there's many other nodes within it, which are sites of study and things like that. But there's a sort of macro and micro embeddedness of the work, and so the ring road is part of this network, which is reaching out to
You could
new
see
builds
the
and
starfish.
things.
I mean, this from
Yeah.
space. You can see that reaching out.
And so my question is, all of a sudden, when that ring road isn't just connecting the cities of Thailand to ports, to when it cuts directly to
That new
Chennai,
axis, east, west, north,
yeah,
south.
what kind of new meta-cities get formed in those junctions? Because, and that's the question I'm dying to explore. And I have, an outstanding invitation because I know that people are building the road across the mountains in Burma to get on the four-wheel thing and do the survey, and I just don't have time. But because it's going through very, very specific landscapes along the way, and it gets followed by tourism and all sorts of things that happen in the wake of the kind of more logistical development of it. And so, yeah, lots of border projects that are extremely interesting that I'd love to share with you, and at each of these moments, and even switching sides of where the car goes. Yes, thank you. You have to make sure I don't sign up for another term.
Okay.
Hello, New York. You hear that? I finished in a year and a half.
Any other comments, quick interjections, reflections?
Well, this has been a 10-year conversation. It's going to go on for at least 10 more years. Thank you so much.
Good. Wonderful for your patience. Thanks. Good. So we can repair to some more interesting and useful pursuits.
Food.